My name is Jonathan Friedland. I'm the moderator for the day. This is the Effective Board, episode number 3 of the Financial Employees webinar series, Board of Directors Bootcamp 2025. The producers of this, or the co-producers of this webinar, are Financial Poise and the National Law Review. And if you want to read a little bit something about them, you can take a look at slide 68 and 69. And if you're not watching the screen, I will tell you that as I said those slide numbers, I turned to those slides. And I'm going to keep trying to do that. When I reference slide numbers, because I know the slides relate to something we're talking about, I'll go ahead and signal it verbally, and I'll try to turn to the slide. Panelists. Our panelists today are Alan Grafman of All Media Ventures, Alex Sharp of Sharp Consulting, and David Spitolnik of Spitolnik Advisors. Our names and some bios about us are contained on slides starting on slide 55. Well, 55 is just sort of the preview slide. You got to turn to 56 to start seeing our visages. So neither Financial Poise, the National Review, nor we intend this to be an infomercial, if you will. So we're not gonna, we always dispense with the standard 30, 60, 90-second blurbs about ourselves. We trust you. If you have any reason to want to find us, you'll know how to find us. You can read our bios. That's all I've got to say about that. That's an infamous phrase now, but I digress. So what else do I need to tell you before we start? There are a group of slides starting at slide 60 that advertise a series of webinars that go much deeper than this series goes, should you be interested. I commend it to you. I'm also biased because I moderated the damn thing. The last thing before we begin is slide 4, very important slide. That's the disclaimer reminding you that we are not your lawyers or advisors of any kind. You're not our clients. Today is for your general education and edification. So you know what not to do. So without further ado, I can begin the games. And you won't have to listen to me talk a whole lot. These guys will be doing hopefully most of the talking. The first slide I want to direct your attention to is slide 14. For a board to be effective and have productive meetings, a board needs to be well organized and well prepared. That's, pretty common sense. Slide 14 outlines a basic framework to help ensure that happens. And it's courtesy of our friends at the Family Business Consulting Group out of Chicagoland. We may come back to it on purpose, intentionally throughout, but we may not. Nonetheless, keep slide 14 as your touchstone as we have this conversation. Let's start. First question coming up, and David, this is a fair warning to you. The first question is going to implicate slides 11 through 13. Let's start with a quick overview of the essential roles of a board. Why is a board in place? What are the most essential responsibilities of the board? David.
Thank you, John. I think that these slides state it very well. I think that from my perspective, the reason to have a board is to act on and to think with the company about all of these issues that are showing up. And more importantly, or as importantly, as noted at the beginning here, that it brings additional points of view to the party. Too often when you have a company, you have people that have been working together, that have been, for all intents and purposes, singing from the same book for a very long time. And they're not necessarily, even though hopefully a lot of them have their eyes on what's going on, they are there. They're not as engaged or involved outside the company as they could be. And so having a board brings other ideas, brings other levels of here's our perspective on what's happening. One of the other things that happens with the board is that they are helping, depending on how the charter and how the bylaws are written and whether it's a fiduciary or an advisory board, and we'll get into some of that other stuff later on, but they're helping the leadership of the company make big decisions about big issues that are not just focused on what's going on inside, but helping to think about things like succession planning, helping when they need to find a new leader, helping to find the new leader. And so the board is there to provide insight and to help guide the company on what they're doing. And then these things that are on this page is very often you will hear about, especially with smaller companies, you'll hear about somebody going through an M&A or through a divestiture or something, and they want another set of eyes on it. They don't necessarily want a consultant, but they want somebody to come to the table who's there, who can get into understanding how the business is run, and so can help them think about other things going on in the market, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, entry into new markets. I've seen a number of times where people, have said, "We're here. We want to attack this place. What do you guys think?" And the board acts as a very powerful tool to help them think, help ask them questions about where they're going and why and how. So again, it's that the whole thing for having a board is bringing a third party to the table to help manage and lead you, but also help ask and answer questions about what's going on outside.
Thank you, David. Guys, before we move on, is there anything else on these slides or otherwise that and either of you want to amplify? Going once, going twice. Okay, next question is going to be to Alex. Alex, oh, and audience, we're going to turn to slides 52 and 53, and then all the way back to 19. Um, Alex, one way to make a board more effective is to use committees. What committees does a private company commonly have, and how does it decide what committees to have?
Okay. Well, thank you, Jonathan. So it's really interesting when you're dealing with a privately held company. The board has a lot of latitude. Now, there are some exceptions. So if you have a very large, I mean, multi-billion dollar organization that even though it's privately held, it may be considered systemically important or based on where it resides, the laws may be such that it has some requirements on you. But other than that exception, a privately held board has a lot of latitude on what committees they have and they don't have. In in my experience working with privately held companies, the ones that are thinking a couple of steps ahead will have an audit or finance committee. And what do I mean by that? Simply put, an organization that is growth oriented, looking a few steps down the road, looking at their exit strategy or their long-term prospects, understands that anything they want to do further down the road, whether it be M&A, they want to get acquired, possibly go public, look for financing, whatever it is, they're going to need solid financials. So having a finance slash audit committee is incredibly valuable. The other thing to think about is why do you have committees? And oh yeah, before we leave that, then we'll talk about why you have committees. Additional committees beyond that are really at the determination of the chair based on the specific needs of the organization. So for example, if you're in a highly regulated environment, you may want a regulatory and compliance committee. If you are building devices, say like medical devices where safety is of paramount concern, you may want to have a safety committee, right? To just pay focused attention on that area. Now, in general, the idea with the committees is there's really three types. There's standing, ad hoc, and advisory. Standing means focused, it's there for a reason, long-standing, permanent duration, It's there until there's a deliberate act on the part of the board to dissolve it. Ad hoc and advisory, very much related. Ad hoc means it comes and goes as needed. Now, that could be a committee that just gets reinvigorated time and time again when it's required, or it may have been brought up for a specific instance. Let's say you're doing a acquisition. You may have an M&A committee that is really composed of folks across the board, and it comes together when you're doing M&A transactions or something similar. An advisory is a little different than the other two in that it could be longstanding, it could be ad hoc, but the ad hoc, the advisory committee does not have fiduciary responsibilities. It's purely an advisory role.
So let me stop you there. The one thing you didn't say, but it's just a, sort of a logical truism, is of course why form committees at all? Because most boards, if they meet quarterly for a couple of hours a quarter, that's just not enough time to, to do everything that needs to be done. Most of the work of a board doesn't happen in the 4 quarterly meetings. Not that they have to be quarterly, but most of the work of a board happens in between the full board meetings, whether in committee or otherwise. Guys, do you want to overlay on Alex's answer before I move us on? Anything? No? Okay. So I'm turning to slide 48. Alan, this one's to you. It's axiomatic that a board is only as strong as its individual members. How do companies determine the right mix of board members? How do they determine the best set of experiences and expertise to bring into the boardroom?
So thanks, John. I'm going to outline 3 ways to think about it. One is criteria, one is skills, and one is fit. Criteria, there is a continuum between specialization and between generalization, general skills. Every board is different. Every board has different business challenges. Every board has different components, which we'll get to in a moment. But one way to think about it is if your board has a lot of one, you may want to balance it with some of the others. So if you have a board that is deeply specialized in the business that you're in, you may do well to get a successful business executive who is not in that sector, who brings different perspectives, who has perhaps a wider lens. Conversely, if you have all generalists who are very successful, you may and probably should get some specialization on your board. So that's one criteria. Pardon. The next is, which is very hard and doesn't show up on a checklist when you're interviewing candidates, is soft skills. And we'll talk about that more further on. But there may be tremendous candidates whose soft skills are exceptional or not. There may be candidates who come out of an environment where their word was the only word that mattered, or you may have candidates who have led large organizations. I mean, one of the examples are that the difference between Dwight Eisenhower in a general and Patton. Patton could not have done Eisenhower's job. And whether Eisenhower could have done Patton's job is an interesting conversation. But the point is that you want to have a mix. You want to have a mix of that, and you want to understand the soft skills. And the third criteria that I'll mention is the fit. Everyone perhaps who has college-age children know that so much of it is the fit. So much of it is how does your individual fit? And so how a board works, it's dynamic to the degree that it's collegial or not, to the degree that it's formal or not, to the degree that it is well functioning or not. Those are all factors. So again, as it relates to selecting board directors, you have the question of specialization as opposed to general excellence. You have the question of skills, soft skills versus hard skills. And you have the question of how does this individual fit into the board as it exists. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Overlay? David, I'm thinking about forming a company, and because I want to have all the lots of expertise on the board, I'm thinking I'm going to have about 57 board members. What do you think about that? In other words, what's the right number of directors? How do you answer that more realistic that non-sarcastic question?
Well, the beginning of it is I can definitively say that unless you are in a not-for-profit, 57 is not the right answer. And the 57 in the not-for-profit, that's a whole other set of discussions that we can have about why not-for-profit boards are as big as they are, but we'll stay away from that. The simple answer to my simple answer, not the simple answer to the question of what's the right number is good news or bad news, there is no right number. There's a number that is, the way that I think about what's an appropriate number, not right, but appropriate number is how many people can effectively participate in a discussion. And I think when you get into this, when you start thinking about that, from my perspective, it's probably somewhere between 7 and 10, maybe a few more, than that. But you need to have, if you're meeting, as we were talking about, a couple of, once a quarter for 3 or 4 hours, if you've got too many folks in the room, you're really not going to get a chance to press them and to get, to have them engaged and involved. Now, you've got a very specific issue that you are talking about. You can bring other people to the table. You can bring consultants in to talk to you. But in terms of the board itself, you need to understand what are the things you're looking for. It goes back to some of what was said before. You're looking for industry knowledge, you're looking for market knowledge, you're looking for functional knowledge, both short-term and long-term answers in each one of those. And then, and again, specific to your company. So it's one of those questions that is, you know, I don't know how many times we've all heard, I'll know it when I see it. Well, you've got to have your bylaws may say you can have up to 15, but for whatever reason, you, the chair, or you, the company, say, well, I don't need all of those people. The other thing to think about is when we're talking about, that's talking about a fiduciary board perhaps, but a board for not a closely held company. When you get into a closely held business, there are going to be inevitably some family members that are on the board that are not active in the business. And they may have a different perspective, and they've got a perspective about what ownership of the business wants, but they've got a different perspective than what the people coming in to help think about the business and the market and all those kinds of things are. So I'm glad that there's no specific answer, only because it helps. It gives us things to do when we're talking to people about forming boards. When I'm talking to you, Jonathan, about forming that board for that new company, it's let's talk about what you want the board to do, and then we can start figuring out how many people it is we need in order to be able to address the types of issues that you're interested in addressing.
So in terms of, let me ask a follow-on question. The board has access to the totality of the experience of its members, but the resources a board has access to is certainly not limited to its members. You mentioned in passing, the notion of bringing in outside advisors, but what about the company itself? How can boards leverage company resources effectively?
It's a very appropriate kind of question, and part of it is something we'll talk about in a little while. But part of this notion of how can we leverage internal is understanding what the rules are with regards to our individually approaching internal members of the leadership team, because there are some boards where, and many where, they don't want you, the board member, to go directly to somebody in a position in the company unless either the CEO, whatever, are with you, or there's a specific set of things that they set up. So understanding when there are people in the company that are subject matter experts about an issue that you at the board are dealing with, that's an appropriate time for them, for those subject matter experts to come to the board and talk to the board, perhaps address with a specific committee. We were talking about, if it's the accounting committee or whatever, finance and audit committee, whatever, there are people inside the company that you want to deal with. It is very much about what are the rules of engagement. And I know, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but these rules of engagement are so critical. And I've seen situations where board members have not followed those rules and have gone around, and it all it does is create chaos, and because somebody hears that the board member wants to talk to them, do they go and ask the CEO or the president for permission? Well, no, they've heard from the board member, so they assume that they've got permission to talk to them. So it's got to be, um, we've got to make sure that we understand who's there and why. And then we, the board, need to make sure that if there's something going on where we feel there are insiders with knowledge that can be used and they're not being brought, we pose to the leadership of the board the question, where the hell are these guys? Let's get them here to the table so that we can talk to them. So again, it is understanding what those resources are and then trying to use them, but using them within the guidelines that are set forth for the board to operate.
Thank you. Guys, any overlay?
The only thing I want to say is really highlight what David was talking about with the rules of engagement and where the exceptions are. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes there are issues that come to light or where it involves officers of the company where just by the nature of what has come up, they need to go around or outside for the expertise and to work the issues. There's also sometimes, and it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, it often makes the news, where for one reason or another, the board effectively takes over the company for short periods of time or fills in discrete spots for short periods of time. And those are very careful decisions, and they're really truly exceptions that need to be factored into the rules of engagement. They're not easy, but it has to be a very deliberate act. It can't be a random, hey, I just feel like it today thing, right? Those are, tough situations.
I think that one of the things that Alex points out is, I mean, I work with the Private Directors Association to help in the private company governance series, and we talk in the case studies that we're working with, we talk about what happens when there's an ethics violation.
Exactly.
And what do you do, and how do you, the board, respond to an ethics violation? And so the company needs to have a specific spelled out practice, not practice, but this is the way that we do this. And so you as the board need to know what you are empowered to do and what you're not empowered to do in order to address those kinds of issues.
I'm going to make an observation. Most companies in the United States have paper boards, right? Meaning that most companies are small little affairs where there's an owner operator and he or she is the single board member. And there's really no point of demarcation between where his or her duties start and stop as between owner, CEO, or president and board member. And the line between these companies and companies that have more formalized boards, because there's multiple owners, they're backed by venture, or they're PE owned, or whatever. The company's large enough that it no longer has a paper board. It's I just kind of want to throw out there for those in the audience who are with companies that have paper boards. We're clearly not talking about them. I'm gonna hit a couple of slides, a few slides really fast before I resume my questioning. And I'm just gonna display them, and this will be the chaos round. You guys, or what's that test? The ink blot test?
Rorschach.
Yeah, thank you. So does anybody want to say something about this slide? Slide 16. Going once, going twice. How about this slide?
I think that this is one that is, in many cases, too often violated. That people wait until the last minute to get minutes, to get presentations, and when you do that, you don't give the board members the opportunity to think about the materials that they're going to be asked to talk about and to address. And so having those kinds of things in advance, and this is true whether it's a fiduciary board, whether it's an advisory board, frankly, this is true for any not-for-profit board. Having the information in advance, and 3 to 5 days, okay, maybe 3 days, but you get much shorter than that. You really haven't given the board members, first of all, you haven't appreciated the fact that most of your board members have other things going on in their lives besides what they're doing with and for your company, your organization. And so if you think that you can hand it to them, a day before and they'll drop everything in order to address it, I respectfully submit that that's not the case. So anyway, I think it's that one about how early do you get them information, in a timely fashion, enough time so that they have the time to think about it and use it, look at it.
Yeah, since David jumped in, I'm going to amplify a bit. This is actually touching on one of my hot buttons I thought we were going to hit later. Meetings are won and lost before you ever walk into the room. And if you want to have an effective meeting, people need to come to the table prepared and ready to work. If they haven't had the time to digest the pre-reading, give it some thought, maybe kick it around with other board members, what have you, you're going to have a less productive meeting. It's going to take longer, and longer term, it's going to hurt the company. So, yeah, to David's point, this is something that gets violated way too easily and has long-term impact.
Thank you. Alex, this next question is for you, audience, slide 29, switching topics. The board meeting itself, supporting committee meetings require skillful navigation. We know this to be so. We know that the engaged board member is not just better than the unengaged board member. It's critical to be engaged. When you see a member who it appears not to be engaged, what are some ways that the other members of the board can change that? Slide
Well,
20.
yeah, so we're talking about an individual board member who's not as engaged. It's very situational and it's also stylistic. So if you have somebody that is in their first or second board meeting ever, they could just be sitting back trying to get the lay of the land, right? It so it's very situational. It also depends on personality. For me, as the board chairman, I would be actively taking the pulse. And if there appeared to be somebody that's pulling back or not as engaged as you'd like them to be, ask them. If you have a nominating committee or you had somebody that sponsored this person to be on there, I would maybe have them ask it. But if I was a regular board member, one of the things I'd want to be doing is developing a good relationship with my other board members. And if somebody seems to not be engaging the way they should or usually are, again, ask them. I would not call it out in public. These would be private conversations.
Anyone want to overlay?
I had an interesting experience. I joined a board, and it was a board that I could have tremendous impact. And I made such an impression that they asked me to step off of the board afterwards. Now, so the tale of the tape is enter quietly, but there's a happy ending. I told him that would not be a good idea for someone who just joined the board and was chair of the audit committee to be stepping off the board after a month. So I ended up many, many years staying on that board. I ended up becoming CEO of that company. But the more important lesson is enter quietly, particularly at that first meeting, because you don't want to make too strong an impression.
I'm going to stick with you, Alan, for the next question.
Can I just,
Um,
before you go to that, just to
Yeah.
Alan's point, and I think we've talked about this before, and we will probably talk about it again. This notion of when you walk into a board meeting, when you walk into any kind of encounter, you have two eyes, two ears, two nostrils, and one mouth. You should use them in that proportion when you're going into a new situation and understand that you need to learn, even though you know a lot, and understand that you can teach, but use your input mechanisms also at a high priority, as a high priority at the beginning. Sorry, Alan, go on.
Perfect.
You can't. I didn't ask a question yet. But I will. Audience, we're going to spend a few moments on slides 44 through 46. And let's, I know you've been a board chair a number of times. And, the board chair, of course, plays a large role in influencing the agenda, the topics that comprise the agenda. Share with us the role of the board chair in the actual board meeting beyond just setting the agenda. What have you seen a board chair get right? What have you seen a board chair get wrong? What have you done right and what have you done wrong?
So a couple thoughts. When I was elected chair, I put together one page of what I would be doing as chairman of the board and what the CEO would continue to do, because I wanted total clarity that I was not a threat to that CEO, that I was there on behalf of the entire board. So, and by the way, by board chair, we're not talking about independent director, we're talking about fully empowered chairman of the board. There are some key points here. I would say, though, that the bigger point is the chairman of the board should view themselves and should be viewed by the board and management as the linkage, as the key point of contact initially and between board meetings. It's really important that the board chair have the trust of the board members, so board members can come to the chairman, and similarly, that the CEO can have that level of trust in the board chair. There are many, many instances that you want to have issues dealt with or discussed, or at least surfaced in a way that can lend themselves to resolution. And that is the board chair's role. It really is the linkage. You want an independent board, not a chairman. You don't want a chairman who is also CEO, because that defeats the whole purpose. And as far as the agenda, which John, I think was part of your question, the board chairman is fundamental, perhaps not always the first, but I would say always the last word in the agenda. And sometimes the secretary will prepare an agenda and the board chairman can modify it, can get the feedback. There may be something from one of the committees that is really urgent that needs to switch the order. So again, board chairman is the linkage, and a well-run board reflects well on a board chairman. A poorly run board process reflects poorly on the board chairman. I would say the biggest mistake that I have seen by board chairs is not viewing themselves as being the linkage, not doing the work, not putting in the time, not understanding that their role is more than to sit at the end of the table. There really is work between board meetings. That, I think, is the biggest mistake that I most often encounter.
Fellas, any overlay? Hearing none. As an effective chair, so to speak, as moderator, I'll move us on to slide 22, audience. Alex, one common phrase we hear describing how directors should behave is nose in, fingers out. What does that mean?
Yep.
And how does the board know when it's crossing this invisible line?
Yeah, well, the short answer is, with few exceptions, there is no bright line test. The the expression really refers to the board is really there to represent the shareholders. Now, in a private company, especially family owned or closely held, other shareholders can actually be on the board, which is a different dynamic that we'll put aside for a second. But the board's job is really direction and oversight, right? Are things going in the right direction? Are we doing the right things? Is there a check and balance between the officers of the company and the shareholders' interests that are represented by the board? So a lot of it is not about day-to-day operations of the company. It's about keeping enough distance to be more strategic, to not have conflicts of interest in how things are done day to day. It's about being objective. And that's what that phrase always means to me. It's about maintaining the bigger picture, the longer term view without getting mired in the day to day. Now, that, like we were talking about before, there are some instances a lot of times around ethics and some other situations where the board may actually have to get in and take over or dig in deeper way. Those things in a perfect world would be mapped out long before they happen. And at the very least, there would be guidelines. So when situations present themselves, you know what the situation looks like, when to get involved, and more importantly, for how long and how to step back. So there is no
Overlay.
test.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just
Overlay,
gonna,
fellas. Oh, we keep bumping into each other.
yep, we do. It's the time delay. Go for it.
Any overlay, fellas?
Nope.
Then thank you. I'm displaying slide 22 right now, titled the board agenda. I'm about to turn to slide 21, meeting objectives. And in the context of these slides, to the extent that you want to make it your context, David, talk to us about a typical board meeting. What are the objectives of a board meeting generically?
I think that this lays it out. I think that a couple of other ways of saying some of this stuff is, um, uh, you know, you do, well, we don't want to get down and dirty, get our heads in the mud. We do need to keep the board apprised, and maybe it's in the information they get before the meeting, but it's almost giving them a highlight overview of the good, the bad, and the ugly that is going on in the business and in the market and whatever, so that they have context in which to understand what they're hearing about. Now, again, it doesn't mean that we've got to go on a day by day basis to say, this happened on Monday and this happened on Tuesday, and unless it's one of those very specific issues that Alex was just talking about in terms of something that we do need to address. But it's this, the good, the bad, and the ugly is something that I think boards need to hear about. And then this whole notion of what are the issues that need the board's attention? We've gotten the agenda ahead of time. We've gotten reading materials ahead of time, and the objective is to get the board and have the board chair get the board to the point of coming to some level of agreement, hopefully consensus, but some level of agreement on what are the actions that we need to take around the specific issues that have been raised that the company is looking for our insights on. And then the last point, and the last point on this slide also is just are there other action items from our discussion or that have come up, either from the discussion or that are going on or that are ongoing? What are the things that the company needs the board's help in thinking about addressing? I go back to the stuff that we were talking about before. If the company is looking at entering into a new market, what is it that they're looking for out of the board for help, and making sure that there are points where the board can, here's what I know about this market. Or, I spent a lot of time when I was working doing merger, acquisition, divestiture, joint venture work. And it was always helpful when, we would form, when we were doing joint ventures, especially international joint ventures, having people that were not part of the partners necessarily, but having others sitting at the table to help us understand what was going on in the market where we were doing the joint venture. And then, and equipping us on the board to then make informed decisions about what needed to happen in that particular market. And that was a very, very, that just helped keep the board moving.
Overlay. So now we're going to flip back to slide 22, and we're going to also glance at slides 23, 24, and 25. And I'm going to ask Alan, how do you go about building an agenda for a board meeting? I think that's a funny question, but
Yeah, a little bit.
how
So
you gonna?
there's a great order. So the board chairman should talk to everyone who's going to be in the room. You can get a draft from the corporate secretary. You should get the minutes from the previous meeting for sure. You should, obviously, this is a pretty good pro forma agenda. But in short, the chairman should get input from every attendee that is going to be at the meeting, particularly the committee chairs, and should understand even what the committee chairs, because they will usually or often meet during a break, not always, but then sometimes the other board members will be invited to attend as observers. That is something that can be done. So in short, you can get a draft from the general secretary, the corporate secretary. You can pull the minutes and the agenda from the previous time, and you can speak to the appropriate executives and board members. And that all goes into an agenda that you, as board chair, should own. You're certainly welcome to have input, but it's your judgment as to the order. It's your judgment to the allotment of time. And it's also one thing that was not on that was executive session, by the way. Generally, good board chairman will put an executive session for the outside independent directors before and after. So that was not, Jonathan, I don't think, on your pro forma slide 24 agenda. And you may want to add it for next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we talked about the agenda per se. Let's talk about how the board meeting runs more generally, if you will. And audience, to do that, I'm going to call your attention to slides 30 to 31 and 49 to 51. I'll do what I've been doing, and I'll kind of scroll between them as Alex answers the question for us.
Okay. So like any other meeting, there's really three stages: the beginning, the middle, and the end. And let's assume you've done your homework like Alan just laid out. Your pre-reading has been circulated with plenty of time for folks to absorb and come together. So when you have the meeting, one of the first things that happens is the chairman needs to verify that there's a quorum, and a lot of that is dictated by your charter, your bylaws. And when that happens, you call the meeting to order, which is literally calling the meeting to order. And it needs to be on the record that you have a quorum, who's in the room, accept the meeting minutes, right? There's kind of some administrative procedures in the very beginning, but it's really about officially kicking off the meeting, then marching through the agenda. In the agenda should be list of topics, who from the company would be presenting, what outside bodies or representatives may be coming in, marching through that. To Alan's point, there needs to be at least one executive session. I think the standard, um, what's industry considered industry best practices, like he said, is to have two. But there's no hard and fast rule. You can have three if you want, depending on
I
what.
always do three, beginning, sometime in the middle, and end.
Some people prefer that.
Yeah.
I tend to think it's a good idea, but there is no bright line test and no hard, fast rules. I do think anything less than two, you're kind of missing something, but we're talking about a privately held company. What is important, not always talked about, there needs to be an accommodation for the different committees. Whether they meet or they report during the meeting is a lot about how the board is structured. Sometimes boards like to have the committees do the work in between the sessions. Uh, Others tend to want to have a combination. A lot of it depends on your agenda, the culture, your board, what your what your bylaws say and the like. Closing it out is very, very important and actually has a couple of things that go about it, right? You need to have somebody make a motion. It needs to be second. Um, they need to acknowledge in the meeting minutes that that's happened and that also there is no additional business to be done, right? That needs to be declared. I always like to keep a track of open actions, a list of agenda items for the next meeting, maybe some tasking or activities around specific committees. During the meeting, it's always good for the chairman or whoever the chairman designates to ensure that things are kept civil, maybe keeping time to keep things moving, and then to act as a scribe, which is slightly different than the official meeting minutes. Whatever the scribe records, like actions and the like, may be converted into should be converted into an official document and then entered into the minutes. And that's really um, a lot of information very quick. Oh, one other thing, Robert's Rules of Order. I think you had that in one of the slides. Good news, bad news. If you follow Robert's Rules of Order religiously, you'll spend more time arguing about the rules than actually getting the work done. With that said, they are very useful to have in your charter. And when things get too far off course, you can leverage them to get back on track. And there are some basic things like making a motion to close a meeting, having it second, taking votes, similar things like that are a really good idea, but I would not get draconian about using the Robert's Rules of Order.
We talked a moment ago, we mentioned the concept of closed sessions. Let's round that. Let's add a little bit of meat to the bones because we didn't really define it very well. That's slides 26 and 27. So Alan, why don't you do the honors for that one? And then we'll answer that and then I know I follow up.
Okay, and just to follow up on something Alex touched on. While other people may keep notes, scribe, I think is the term, and they may or may not get into the minutes. You want the minutes to be the only surviving record of the meeting. There are numerous instances where contemporaneous notes taken during a meeting were used against a company. One practice is everybody turns in their book, which has notes, their board book with notes, and turns it in, and it's destroyed. So sidebar, just very briefly on that. So closed sessions.
Bringing that up. Thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, you're welcome, Alex. So a closed session. So generally, closed sessions serve two purposes. One is informal camaraderie of the independent directors, which in some private companies, it could be lonely, they could be embattled, they could have a CEO who doesn't appreciate them. They may be there at the insistence of one shareholder and at the resistance of the other shareholders. The story is often told that the happiest day of a CEO's life on the day of a board meeting is when he sees the tail lights of the directors leaving the building. So, executive sessions allow independent directors to talk amongst themselves. In addition, there is usually often issues that for the board at large touch on someone at the board table. It could be a succession plan. It could be a compensation issue. It could be a litigation. It could even be insurance as to who's covered to what degree. So the point is that executive sessions is it's a great handy tool. When they're regularly scheduled, it's the best of all worlds, because then it's like, hey, there's nothing, nothing going on here. We're just going to have our regular executive session. And then we get an executive session. It's like, you're not going to believe what I just heard driving over here. So when they're regularly scheduled, it's like a Swiss Army knife. They serve a lot of great purposes. So did I answer your question, Jonathan?
Yes, sir.
The only other thing that I would add to this is, and we're talking about closed sessions and executive sessions as if they were the same things. And there are times when you do have an executive committee of the board that is another committee of the board where things are being talked about that is a smaller committee, and there are minutes that are needed for that, as well as for closed sessions, which are the entire board, where where members perhaps of the management aren't invited to those meetings. And so it's just, I mean, all of the same rules that you've just described, I think, Alan, are in order, but making sure that we understand that there are closed sessions and that there can be an executive session, which is different than a closed session.
Well, that's good. And also, by the way, just to follow up on that, in my experience, never took notes during executive sessions.
So who generally, David, just elaborate on what you were saying. In addition to the members of the board of directors, who typically will be included in a board of directors meeting?
Well, in a board of directors meeting, and so we're now going out of a closed session or an executive session. In a board meeting, it is not uncommon, for example, to have some of the senior leadership of the company there, because they're going to be providing input into some of the discussions that are going on. It may very well be that the CFO is there to talk about finance and he leaves, the marketing, he or she leaves after that discussion. The head of operations is there, leaves after a discussion about that. And there may be something else where there's a general company discussion where all of the senior leadership is there for that discussion. But as with most things, it gets into the it depends category, where depends on what's being talked about, depends on how much input is needed from people from the company leadership, as you are going through these various issues.
How do we know when, if we're board members, how do we know when we should be considering retaining out external experts, attorneys, consultants, other advisors, Alex? And we're now in the speed round because we're running out of time.
All right, real quick. I tend to look at three categories. You need expertise. You need to rent expertise that you don't currently have. You need Christmas help because of volume, or you need a source of objectivity and credibility. All right, the first two are kind of easy to understand. The objectivity and the credibility is a little different. Sometimes as a board, you can be getting, just as an example I use, you're getting conflicting information, or you need a deeper investigation. So you bring in an objective third party to give you just that, an objective view. Sometimes you run into situations, most commonly with ethics or something that could deal with some sensitivities, where you might need some credibility around the findings or an external voice. So again, I look at expertise, volume, objectivity, and credibility.
Thank you. Switching gears a lot, Alan, I'm going to give you 50% of our remaining time to, how about that? Slides 34 through 38, we're going to talk to us about team building.
All right, thank you. So in 120 seconds, the most effective director is a director who helps a board and a company resolve conflicts and conflicts that arise out of challenges. So that often will not be a technical discussion. It often might not even be a business discussion. It can often devolve into an emotional discussion. And for everyone that's had children, again, you know that when the children elevate the emotion, the most effective response is to keep the emotion lower and not as volatile. So one of the ways to do that is to understand and in advance, the expression drill your well before you're thirsty, I'm a fan of. In advance, hopefully, the person has developed relationships with all of the participants, has taken time to have met with one-on-one with all of the directors, and if he's chairman, has met regularly with the CEO. So there is a bond of, I'll say even emotional attachment. So the point is that the emotional attachment that a board chairman can foster will help a company get below the surface and will help get to yes much more quickly. So the point is those soft skills are not on a checklist. Those soft skills are developed. If you're on a board, for instance, here you see the different level of skills where a board chairman can help develop a culture that respects softer skills, a culture that minimizes emotional or ad hominem, and a culture that allows for connectivity that is deep and inures to the benefit of the company and the shareholders. So that's a 120-second version, perhaps.
Thank you. Alex, 30 seconds or less, slide 42, audience. How do we know if our board meeting was effective?
30 seconds or less. Did you not through all your agenda items? Is everybody walking away feel like they got done what they needed to get done? Did the officers of the company have what they need?
Great. Overlay, guys. Alan, people often sit through a board meeting and walk away unclear about the next steps and accountabilities, responding to what Alex just, was asking. What are some good practices to ensure that the meeting outcomes are clear and action is taken? Slides 41 and 32, audience.
Okay, so the basic is if there's executive session at the close, nobody should walk out of executive session of the attendees there with any question about what happened or what needs to get done. For the ones that weren't, and then it's on the board chairman to convey that to the management team, the CEO, and also to incorporate perhaps from directors that were not in the executive session. So it's not rocket science. You need to cover it at the last executive session at the end of the day. You need to be aligned. The board chairman needs to take that forward to the non-attendees of that executive session.
David, you're blessed with the last question of the day. My question to you is, what are some ways you've seen directors engage with the company in between meetings on anything, whether it's a general matter or a specific matter? You may answer that question, or you may pick your own.
I think that the engagement is about it's both about dealing with what's at the meeting as well as, and it's things that we've talked about in terms of continuing to build the understanding of what's going on in the company. So what are the informal opportunities for board members to engage with the company in stuff, and informal but planned. So again, it's not the board member just reaching out and saying, I'm going to do this. And it's also about continuing to build the board team, helping the board to come together, helping the board to understand who they are so that they can, a team that has everybody who never talks to each other, when they get together, they don't know how to interact. And so how do you build the camaraderie? Camaraderie is perhaps not the right word, but how do you build the team so that when I say X, this is generally what I mean when I've said X. When somebody else says X, this is generally what they mean. And so understanding who is at the table and how they're dealing with each other is a very important piece of what happens in between board meetings. Sorry, excuse me.
That was the last word. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for your time. Audience, we thank you for your time. We hope you learned something and enjoyed. Enjoyed? Is this entertainment? I don't know. Is it infotainment? The webinar's over. Thank you. Come again.